try that thing. I'm not afraid.
Well, welcome back, everybody. Good afternoon. Tom Hudson with WLRN and Miami Herald News. Great to be still with you, and thank you for coming back after lunch. As you can imagine, that is the setup for a conversation around transportation. Now, I have to share with you, just from a personal and a professional note, that as somebody who makes their living on the radio, we are interested in having solutions to transportation, but we also benefit from the more time you spend in your car. So I just want to state that for the record here for full transparency. So what's going to happen here on stage, actually two conversations focused on transportation and infrastructure as a priority here at the summit. Please join me in bringing to the stage State Senator from the Florida State Senate, Jeff Brandes, and Kim Hart, Managing Editor of Axios. Kim, Jeff, come on up. That extra thing.
Thank you.
I think we're here or here, one of the two.
Sure.
That'll work.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here, Senator.
Oh, my pleasure.
So you have been a big proponent of bringing new technologies to the state to improve transportation and city living on a broad scale. Driverless cars, the sharing economy, multimodal types of transportation. Broadly speaking, to kind of kick us off here, how do you see, in your experience traveling across the state, how do you see technology being infused into transportation?
Yes, I think there's three transitions that are taking place in the world at the same time in the mobility space. You see the world getting more shared with the rise of kind of Uber and Lyft. In the last 10 years, how transformational those have been. You see the world getting more electric, obviously with the rise of Tesla, but now everybody's getting into the electric vehicle space, whether it's VW making their big announcements or Ford. But it seems like all the major auto manufacturers are transitioning to more of electric vehicles. And then this discussion of autonomy or self-driving that's taking place as well. And so any one of those would be challenging for a state to kind of get its arms around. The fact that all three of them are roughly happening at the same time is really overwhelming for the state to kind of get it to really think about. And how do we plan for this incredible future that's going to take place? I think you're going to see more transition in the mobility space in the next 10 years than really you've seen almost in the last 100. I think the next 10 years are really like our great-grandparents' horse and buggy to Model T experience. And so how do we chart this kind of course, this unknown course for the state as a policymaker, and we think about that transition and how it's going to take place?
And this is really, I mean, I've covered Silicon Valley companies for a long time, and their ethos up until now has been broadly, if you build a better software, if you build a better technology, a better user interface, people will come. And that works maybe for social networks, not so much when you need roads and connectivity and highways and parking or lack of parking.
Right.
And it really changes the infrastructure. That is not something that happens overnight. So how do you balance the long-term planning with the short-term need that people still have of getting around while these transitions take place?
So I think you've got to think about it I don't think you can solve all the problems today.
Right.
Right. So my general discussion has been like, let's solve to 2030. Right. Let's not try to figure out how we're going to replace the entire gas tax because all vehicles are going to go electric over time. Right? Let's try to figure out how do we solve the gas tax until 2030, and then some future legislature is going to have to solve for that problem. We don't know what full autonomy is really going to look like and how that's going to affect cities. So let's begin to focus on ideas that maximize our options for the future. I think one of the things the general discussions I'm having with cities is, do I invest in rail? Do I invest in this technology? And my general conversation is invest in those things that maximize your options. This is like us driving into fog, right? On a windy road. You turn the low beams on, you slow down, you're peering out the window, and you're being very cautious because you want to maximize your options because you don't know what lies ahead. That's the best analogy I can give you for what cities are facing moving into this next decade of mobility.
So in some ways that makes a case for not trying to look way into the future because you literally can't.
Right.
You're in the fog. And looking, here are the information that I have right now based on what I know my citizens want, what I know the business community needs, what I know the technology available is out there. How do I make sure that we are building things in kind of concentric circles?
Right. So I think part of it is cities have to, we talk a lot about smart cities and what that means. I think it means something different to every city.
Yep.
I don't think anybody's truly defined what a smart city is. I think it is that we think about cities as prototypes, and that we're working on this kind of prototype city. I mean, if you think about the word Epcot is the experimental prototype city of tomorrow. That is what the definition of the Epcot is. And so how do we think of Florida cities in this Epcot model? How do we allow cities to be prototypes? How do we make strategic investments of a long-term nature or even of a short-term nature where cities feel like they have the ability to look at different options and to fail, and hopefully fail quickly, and then pivot to something that's working, and all learn together off of these different prototypes. I think that to me is how the state needs to be thinking about at least how we negotiate the next few years.
How are you thinking about the intersection of the new technology and like the physical technology that we see and the fiber optic cables underground, the wireless networks that are going to have to kind of blanket our cities and beyond in order to not necessarily make self-driving cars work, they're already working today and they don't necessarily need that technology to function, but in order to get the most, to help them meet their potential and help smart cities meet their potential, how do you balance that?
So I think you really have to I think you need to think that these self-driving cars need to operate independent of the infrastructure. Mm-hmm. That the infrastructure will be there to supplement, to assist, to improve the quality of the ride. But if we wait for government to install, technology in all the stoplights, to get fiber everywhere, then self-driving cars are decades, if not a century away, because it's government. If we allow the technology and the companies to innovate, and then we're there to provide assistance, or if they say, look, it would make this ride better if we installed this technology at your stoplights, but we'll do it on our dime, that to me assists everybody. And we have to think about, it's not just one car company, it's all the car companies. And so what's the kind of Rosetta Stone, the universal language that they're gonna be using across platforms?
And I think that brings up another question that I think we're several years away from really having to grapple with, but that is the digital divide. If we are waiting for, if it's up to companies in some ways to say, I'm going to go to places where I'm going to maximize my profit, maximize my ability to get the users who are going to pay the amount of money to make sure that it's worth my while to be there. How do we make sure that certain modes of transportation or the best services aren't available to a select few, and creating a new kind of have and have not system, both in cities and between the rural and
I think that public transit really evolves into more of a brokerage model where they're seeing low-income individuals and assisting them to make sure they have access to all the mobility options. Okay. I don't think, essentially for you and I, an Uber today or a Lyft today is a driverless car, right? I mean, we're being driven, but the experience for us hopefully will not be that much different when there's no driver versus when there is a driver in the vehicle. And we're not seeing a huge diversion of people who basically can't utilize Uber and Lyft. Mm-hmm. But especially if the price of that Uber and Lyft goes down dramatically because there's no driver in the vehicle. If we can reduce the price to 40 cents a mile, for example, now all of a sudden you've opened up mobility options to people that really had very few options before, not just those that may not have the resources, but maybe the elderly, who we've taken away their keys, and now we've provided them an option for mobility that they really never had before. So I think public transportation really shifts and evolves. I think you have to see public transit as an organism. This organism has to evolve over time. You can't see it as a traditional system anymore. These systems ultimately will end, they'll fail. Organisms evolve. And I think we have to think about public transportation as an evolution, and be open to this idea that maybe the future isn't all 40-passenger buses driving around, that it's using those 40-passenger buses where they make sense, but in the routes that they don't make sense, being able to partner those off to the private sector because it's much more efficient.
What's been the biggest frustration when you're talking to cities about this? I mean, you're talking about prototype cities and not being afraid to experiment and fail, but fail fast. And that's not the language that a lot of cities talk.
No, because I don't think cities have had to deal with this for generations. I mean,
Yeah.
we have basically shifted the state to a car-centric mode. I mean, it largely because it was a vacation destination. Then we got air conditioning, and air conditioning changed it to allowing people to live here full time. And they grew up, the business class grew up over time, and the whole state evolved very, very differently than maybe some of our northern counterparts did.
Sure.
I think the biggest challenge for me when I'm talking to cities is helping them to understand the pace of which this is going to take place and beginning to ask some tough questions. For example, today, electric vehicles in Florida are less than 0.5% of all total vehicles. But by 2030, they may be 5, 10%, 15% of total vehicles. If we have a Hurricane Irma and we've got to evacuate South Florida and you have 15% of your vehicles that are electric, how do you get those out of the state of Florida? How do we recharge them? Like, those are some really interesting questions that at the state level we need to be thinking about. Mm-hmm. Today, predominantly our funds, our transportation and infrastructure funds are funded by the gas tax. Again, when 15% of your vehicle aren't paying the gas tax, that's a noticeable decline, meaningful decline in your overall revenue for mobility and infrastructure. And so how do we begin to have those conversations with cities? Not to mention, how does self-driving of cities affect toll lanes in cities, our parking revenue in cities, or frankly, revenue from police officers pulling people over? Because self-driving cars at least shouldn't break the law. So how do we begin to think about the transition and not only in revenue for cities, but thinking about the bigger challenges that we have? I mean, as I travel around the state, the two challenges I see are transportation and affordable housing. Mm-hmm. These are the challenges of a state that's suffering from prosperity, right? This is a state with 21 million people. We have 1,000 people moving to Florida every single day. We have 120 million tourists that live in this, that are visiting the state. And so how does the challenges and how does this change in mobility begin to affect affordable housing as well?
Right. And how does it affect mass transportation? Where do you see the future for mass transit going?
So I think the future of mass transit comes back to the conversation about maximizing your options. If you're a city, do you make a multi-billion-dollar investment where it costs you $100 million a mile in a light rail system? Or do you say, look, maybe we focus on bus rapid transit, not knowing what the future holds, that we're driving into this fog because these rubber tires will have options for the future.
I see.
Nobody has figured out how to Uberize light rail yet. But we've seen the modes of transportation change on rubber tires. And so my conversations with cities really evolve around make those types of investments that maximize your options. And I think that to me is something that is, it's hard for cities to, because they want to do, right? They so often confuse motion for progress. Mm-hmm. And my goal is, how do we continue to explain that, look, we don't know what the future is going to hold, but here's the trends that we see going on. There's somewhat of a Moore's law taking place in transportation, where computer costs are declining, where with silicon chips getting better, with batteries getting better. I mean, you see this across the platforms. When you have companies like Ford Motor Company saying, we're going to stop making sedans. When you have companies like VW saying, look, we've gone through Dieselgate, and now we're going to make huge investments in electric vehicles. I mean, that's transformational. I mean, nobody was talking about scooters 24 months ago. I had probably never used the word lime and bird in the same sentence my entire life until about 24 months ago, right? And so that just shows you how rapidly the world is changing in the space of mobility, and especially micromobility.
And we were talking with among my group earlier before the panel about some of the challenges with the population, the unique population that Florida has. I mean, right. There's a lot of elderly people who already have a hard time getting around. Mass transit doesn't do it for them. They don't have last mile capabilities. So it's going to expand differently here than it will in a place like Washington, D.C., where I am, or New York, obviously, San Francisco. Where do you see what are some of the more promising experiments that are happening now in Florida that you see as being kind of a peek at the future?
So just this morning, I was with Ford Motor Company as they announced that they had partnered with Walmart to deliver groceries. We see a company called Voyage that's deploying in the villages, which is the largest retirement community in the country, and how they're deploying self-driving vehicles alongside the golf carts of the villages to change people's lives. I think you're going to see across the spectrum a transition take place in a couple different sectors. One, I think the 1 mile to 5 mile range, right? You see this with scooters, with bikes, with vehicles that will weigh a lot less, that we can make smaller. I think you're going to see a complete shift in those types of vehicles. I mean, if you go out to the parking garage right now, every vehicle out there is designed to drive for 4 hours, with 4 or 5 passengers, and I think 10 years from now, you're going to see a very different type of vehicle for short trips. I think you're going to see all of these things be available on one platform, right? The game is changing to be, I have to own the entire platform, which is why Ford just went out and bought a bike company or a scooter company, right? Because they recognize that they want to be all a part of the platform, which is why Uber is investing in self-driving cars in Pittsburgh, because they recognize that they have to have the entire continuum of a platform going forward. I think that's the fascinating thing, is how much of this transition is taking place, how much of it is platform-based, and how many of these players did not exist a decade ago.
Right. So going back to, and our time is out, but I'm going to ask you one more question. In terms of what you want the government, what the state should be doing over the next 1 to 3 years,
right,
what are your priorities for what the legislature should be doing to either make it easier for cities or to work more collaboratively with them?
So my conversations generally with my colleagues in the legislature is educate, don't legislate. We're in this fascinating time between the lightning and the thunder. We don't know what's going to happen. We know something big is coming, but we don't know the exact timing of it. We don't know how far away this thing is. And so let's focus on making sure that we're as open as we can to new technologies. Let's make sure that we have the laws in place that allow scooters to operate on the roads in Florida, that allow autonomous vehicles to be deployed in the state, that we're not over-incentivizing one motor over another because we don't know how it's all going to play out. But let's make sure that we're maximizing our options for the future and that we're not taking anything off the table as it comes to mobility or micromobility.
Thank you so much, Senator Brandes. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Thank you, Senator.